All right, well, let's kick this thing off. Hey, everyone, welcome back. I'm here in Zoom land with my fellow podcaster amigo, Joe Batir, geothermal lead at Petrolern. Joe, welcome to the show. How are you doing? How does it feel to sit on that side of the Zoom land?
Well, Justin, thank you for inviting me. Zoomland is always exciting and recording it as a podcast. I don't know what to say. It's a different feeling. That's for
Right?
sure. Now I'm in the hot seat.
Yeah,
I
no, it's
actually have to
great.
have answers to the questions.
Well, I'm good at asking questions and listening. I oftentimes, every once in a while get invited onto a show and it's cool. I like both sides of it. Although I don't like talking about myself, I'd much rather listen. So it's always fun to sit on that side. But I'm excited to have you on, man. You've been doing, you've got a wealth of knowledge, especially on the geothermal side. You're very technical. You just a fascinating background, but you're also in the podcasting space. And so it's talking to an audience and educating people, I think is something that you enjoy doing, especially with your LinkedIn content. I've noticed you've been doing thermal Thursdays, which I want you to elaborate on here in a little bit, but man, it's all in good fun. And the intent is just to continue educating folks on energy, right? I mean, I think that's why we're here, hopefully do it in somewhat of an entertaining way. But before we get all into the weeds, man, it's, we're recording this in January. How's the new year shaping up for you so far?
The new year it's shaping up better than last year went out.
Okay.
So
How so?
Christmas and New Year's was just a litany of COVID and
Uh,
cancellation of plans. So that's just a not a fun way to end the year on. But then this new year, I think it's been exciting. I've already made one trip down to Houston, meeting with various folks, either podcast guests or clients, hearing a lot of buzz, a lot of excitement around geothermal.
yes.
Today, when we're recording, I just saw a teaser for there's going to be a big, large report about the future of geothermal energy in Texas that's coming out from Project Interspace. That
Super
will be
cool.
released January 24th. So that thing, I guess I don't know when you're going to drop this episode, but that's really exciting. And
Okay.
hopefully that's good news for geothermal energy, not only in our great state of Texas, but also kind of the US, Canada, and the world as a whole.
Right. Well, hopefully there's some major, again, I'm sure there's gonna be a ton of good and valuable information there. Hopefully some breakthrough things that we can at least get excited about. To answer your question, this will be by the time this is released, everyone out there, if you're interested, Joe, where can folks find the report? Because this will be released after the 24th.
Okay, that should be available from projectinterspace.org.
Okay.
And of course, you can always reach out to me. I'm sure by the time this is released, then I will have gotten a copy and read a good portion of it. I think there's the teaser said it's going to have 750 pages or more. So,
Oh, geez.
and I'm a slow reader, so that's going to take me about 3 years to complete.
Well,
But
it's fine, Joe. We've got ChatGPT to summarize the entire thing. It's totally fine.
yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Are you familiar with the AI, ChatGPT, and all that?
I am. I went on there and I tried to, because I saw some hints from some of our mutual friends that said, "Oh, use this to summarize your podcast show notes." And I was like, "Okay." And I asked Mr. Chat, "Hey, how do I upload a Word document?" And it told me, "Oh, I can't. I don't know what you mean. I don't know how to read Word documents." It's like, "Oh, okay." So I guess it's
Right.
just a big copy and paste, but
Yeah.
for being so smart, I didn't
Yeah.
think he was that smart.
I hear you, man. There are limitations to AI.
Yep.
I've definitely tried to find the flaws. But like anything, it's a tool in the toolbox, but I digress. Well, man, so for the listeners, Joe and I actually, originally met while we were working at OGGN, which Joe, you're still podcasting for OGGN, which is a phenomenal platform. Mark, the whole entire team, I have nothing but the utmost respect. Why don't you tell some listeners about your podcast and all the exciting things happening over there at OGGN?
Yeah. So my podcast is the Energy Transition Solutions Podcast. I focus on talking about all things energy transition. That includes upstream oil and gas. How do we decarbonize? How do we make production more efficient in that realm? But then also, what are the new energies that are coming out? How do we develop things like hydrogen and a hydrogen market? How do we make solar and wind more pervasive and what I would say is utilize those to their full potential as opposed to having a 25% capacity factor? How can we increase that further? And then going the things I really like that I enjoy talking about are getting to things like farmers, end users. How do we decarbonize kind of everyday life? What are
Okay.
these big ideas that are helping us as kind of those scope 3 emissions components to these larger companies? How do we actually get to decarbonize through their innovations?
Fascinating. No, that's one thing that doesn't get that much buzz. And so I'm curious, like, all the learnings and whether it be research or folks that you've interviewed, what would you say is some of the low hanging fruit? Because we talk about like new energy supply technology, which, takes millions and this and that. But from like a daily consumer perspective, aside from like unplugging your stuff at night or whatever, like, is there any sort of like low to mid hanging fruit that people haven't really considered or just doesn't get enough attention that can actually make a difference?
Yeah, so I think it's kind of a big question, and
Sure.
as the easiest, fastest answer is something like a Nest thermostat. Those are ways
Mm,
where we can utilize it in some regards. It's kind of like an AI or a machine learning algorithm that learns your patterns and then actively adjusts your temperature in your house or your electricity usage to then lower your electricity usage, but ultimately that's kind of lowering your carbon footprint. Now you can take that, you've got an individual user using a Nest and letting it optimize your house for energy consumption. But then when you start looking at these other companies that are doing virtual power plant agreements and these ideas of consumptive use agreements, you can start building out a what's called a these are distributed energy resources, and you can build something that's the equivalent of megawatts of power that is
mm.
actually saying, okay, when we need you to shut off your hot water heater, I'm going to automatically shut it off. And that's going to save us X number of kilowatts. And now, if I can get my 100 neighbors to do that, we can now start talking about saving megawatts of energy. And in that way, you are building out this very large load balancing plan that really all you have to do is like right now when we have to accept cookies on every single website, that is an opportunity where you could, for some areas, I don't think it's in Texas yet, some areas you can essentially go to our electricity provider and on your contract say, yes, you can control my hot water heater to this
Ah,
extent. So that's
wow.
super easy, super low hanging fruit. I know there's a lot of discussions around privacy and
Yeah, people
intrusion.
don't want to know. People don't like telling people when they're heating their waters to have showers. I get
Exactly.
it. I get
Exactly.
it. Sensitive
Yeah.
information.
Yeah. So that's one of those things that there are some hurdles still to jump, but that is super easy for us because we tell them, we can tell somebody, you put in your widgets, watch our data and save us money.
Yeah.
And that's what we see, but ultimately that saves carbon, that saves energy, and it helps
Yeah.
all of us decarbonize.
Well, one thing I didn't quite understand until, I don't know, maybe over the last 5 years or so, is just how energy inefficient we are, especially here in North America, or call it the US. I mean, I'm from Canada and I did a lot of dumb shit too, with regards to just wasting energy. But point being, I think, to sum it up is if we could get more energy efficient by leveraging technology and data, that's something that you don't need to deploy billions of dollars to create some fancy nuclear plant to save the world's
Mm.
energy needs. You know what I mean? But just
Yep.
all in all, it's just these slow sort of step changes in how we use energy and just become more efficient. I did a really fascinating during grad school. I had one of my economics classes. We used our professor gave us a spreadsheet, and we essentially had to do an assignment where just to kind of like open our eyes as consumers of, we made a list of every electrical device in our home. Then we basically broke it down, and the end result was showing us how much energy we wasted, and then we associated that with the amount of carbon associated with, like, not unplugging our toaster at night. You know
Mm.
what I mean? But like, and so what we did is we extrapolated that for our city to then the nation, making some lofty assumptions. But the amount of money and electricity and carbon associated with just silly little things like unplugging our laptop at night was astounding. And it was just like, oh my goodness, like if we all, or a good portion of us, could jump on board with just being more energy efficient, it could make a huge difference. And that doesn't cost any money. It just takes effort to unplug your freaking iPad or something. You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So, but no, it's a fascinating conversation. But before we keep going, I do want to make an announcement to tell everyone about my new sponsor, Inflow Control. They are a Norwegian technology company dedicated to improving the efficiency of oil recovery while simultaneously reducing the industry and environmental impact using autonomous inflow control valve technology, also known as AICV. This breakthrough technology improves oil production by reducing unwanted gas and water, which ultimately enables mature oil fields to be more profitable by supporting oil production from zones that would have typically been bypassed. To learn more, click the link in the show notes or simply check them out on LinkedIn or at inflowcontrol.no. Okay, back to you, Joe. So, again, I'm going to ask a very high level question that we could probably take in a bunch of different directions. But since podcasting and since really getting sort of more into the world of overall energy needs, what core belief around energy have you changed your mind on over the last few years? Does anything, any sort of paradigm shifts, any principles, has anything changed with regards to that?
I think that I think there are a few things that I would now happily say. I think before maybe you would like talk about it in private, but now I would gladly say it publicly. I'm saying it publicly here. I think one of those first ones is that we're all wrong and we are all far too far too tribal in terms of saying our energy has to be the only one, because I think that we're never going to have a 100% geothermal energy grid. That's not going to happen. As much as I want it to happen, it's not going to happen. And we need to have, and that, I guess that leads into that second point of, this is a net zero society, does not necessarily mean a no carbon society, in terms of we're still going to be using hydrocarbons, but those will be coupled with CCS, and
Right.
there will still be those uses for hydrocarbons that it just makes sense to use that as opposed. This is going to be in all of the above. We're going to need every form of energy being produced, and especially as we use more energy, and as the developing world becomes developed, we're going to need every electron we can get.
Yeah. No, and you know what, to be honest, a lot of the conversations I've had with folks that are somewhat educated or open-minded enough, like it's not even a debate against us versus them. A lot of times and I even see it, and it cracks me up, but it's sad to see grown adults having pissing matches on whether it be LinkedIn or something when someone's trying to put out content that, so for an example, do you know the Energy Strong folks out of Colorado?
Yes.
Okay,
I
so
don't know them personally. I see their stuff though.
but you're aware of them. So they
Yeah.
put out, again, I think they're embracing this energy for all. Again, they come from oil and gas, so there's somewhat biases or assumed biases. But at the end of the day, like I could see them making an attempt to like embrace everything, right? And so they made a post about, it was a lady plugging in her EV, and it said, "We at Energy Strong, we love EVs and we actually drive them." And then it was kind of like, hey, we understand that EVs require energy, and we're here as Energy Strong saying thumbs up for energy, whether you're an EV driver, whether you're an ICE driver, either way, it requires energy. And so, hey, we're Energy Strong and we're here to support your needs. Well, then people on there just started getting all political and crazy about like EVs, and they totally like trolled the post. And I was like,
Mm.
how is that constructive at all? You know what I mean? And so
Yeah.
aside from that, which, unfortunately that's like the silent, well, not the silent majority, but a lot of people still kind of sit in that camp where it's like they kind of sit and pout in the corner. But then most of the people who are somewhat educated, and I say somewhat because again, like you said, like nobody knows, it's such a complex system. Nobody knows all the answers. We're all just trying to figure this shit out, for the lack of better terms. And so, but the ones who are at least open-minded enough to do their own research, to listen to folks like yourself, energy thought leaders who are really, their intent is to find a way to provide enough energy for the world, that's because the demand is going to continue to increase. Most of them say, hey, we understand we need it all. In my early days at OGGN, I had the pleasure of interviewing a gentleman who had been in renewable energy, primarily in the wind energy sector, and I was expecting him to say, no, like, we need to get rid of oil and gas, and he was very much pro natural gas, understanding the critical importance of having a fossil fuel that could ultimately help get us to where we need to be, because this stuff doesn't happen overnight. And so I guess kind of going back to your point is, I think these conversations are being had more and more, and a lot of sort of the incumbent energy supplier, leaders within that industry are even saying, hey, we understand we need to be phased out. Like there's no doubt at some point, not tomorrow, but at some point we need to be phased out. How can we be part of that solution? By, if we're going to produce barrels, how can we do it in the cleanest way possible, or
Mhm.
the cleanest gas possible, or the cleanest way to produce gas possible? So I think the conversation is being had more and more. And, again, conversations like this, I just think are so important. And it's really refreshing to kind of hear your take on that.
Yep. Yeah, I very much enjoy those conversations, and I'm glad that they are being occurring more. I feel like that is it is to your point. Whenever there's that person that just doesn't want to see any other side, it just is. It's not only confusing and baffling, but it's also like it is comical to me
Right.
because there are there are plenty of examples out there where whether it's a buddy from grad school who was talking about his honeymoon and they went to one of these Pacific islands and it was $30 for a and it's like that's because of supply chain and how difficult it is to just get things there.
Yeah.
Or when I was in grad school collecting data at Chena Hot Springs, one of my favorite places to go. This is outside of Fairbanks, Alaska, and they generate all of their power from geothermal. Their power is still 22 cents a kilowatt hour, I think, but that is in comparison to trucked in diesel, which
Mm,
was, I think, 47 cents a kilowatt hour. So
yeah.
it's like, yeah, it's still expensive power, but it's that nuance there that you have to be open to discussing and understanding that it's not either or. It's like there's gray area in between, and that's where we have to understand and move forward.
Yeah, no, I agree there. It's fascinating, and I guess one last thing I'll add to that is, there are folks like you said who will kind of sit in their corner and still sort of have their arms crossed and frown and look down upon everything. But to me, I have a sense of empathy towards that. Like I always try and fascinate it, or I try to at least put myself in their shoes to understand why, right? Because there's a reason for it, and if we can ultimately approach those types of folks. Um, in a kind way, and really try to understand them and listen to some of their concerns, because they might have something that they're thinking about that no one else has thought about, that gives them justification as to why they're going to sit there and still pout. And
Mm,
so I always like to consider that, you know what I mean?
yeah.
Because for so long it's always been like, you have to think of it the way I think of it. Well, everyone comes from a different circumstance, which ultimately leads to different values, different principles, and different ways they view life. So anyway, that's kind of my take on that. But last time I'm going to interrupt, I promise. I do need to share some information about a new partnership that we've landed with Oil Patch. It's basically your daily energy news fix in 5 minutes or less. From the latest breakthroughs to the most bizarre stories, they're your go-to source for all things energy. Think of the hustle or the morning brew for energy. The best part is that they're doing it in an entertaining way and having a blast doing it. So please do them a favor and subscribe using the link in the show notes, or simply go to theoilpatch.co. And although it says oil patch, it's a bunch of oil field folks, but trying to, share news about energy in general. So anyway, appreciate listening. Joe, back to you. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit. A lot of your time is focused in geothermal, which again is, I think, is super fascinating, especially for someone like myself who's in the drilling space. And again, it makes a lot of sense. So tell us your elevator pitch journey in geothermal. How'd you get started? I mean, we don't have to elaborate, but how did you get started in the geothermal space, and then we'll kind of go from there.
Yeah, so I got started knowing that I wanted to be outside doing something interesting, and that led me to geology. Geology led me to some really cool places, Australia and kind of all over the US doing field work. And then I knew I wanted to do something where I felt like I was giving back. That was the energy industry. And at the time, I was also looking at grad schools, ended up going to Iceland for grad school to study geothermal energy.
Oh,
And
wow.
that was one because I love traveling, but also because there was an opportunity there on a Fulbright scholarship to get to do that for free and also study some really cool rocks. So that's
Yeah.
how I got into geothermal energy. And I've stayed in it because it is fascinating. It is a clean energy, reliable baseload power that I think is going to be that it is going to be that foundation of a green energy future. And I think there's opportunities for geothermal kind of all over the world. It's really just a matter of understanding the rocks and then understanding how to produce that. And so if you like being outside, if you like looking at rocks and being in the subsurface and thinking about that, and if you like producing energy, I think geothermal is the way to go.
Awesome. No, it's very interesting. I actually had the pleasure of interviewing Cindy Taff from Geothermal. Uh,
With Sage Geosystem.
Sage, yes, that's it.
Yeah.
Former Shell employee for 30 some odd years. But that was kind of my taste as someone in the geothermal space, aside from what I learned in school. But again, just the potential and it's kind of that the dark horse, right? There's so much potential. You're starting to hear a little bit more about it now, but the reality is it's literally been around forever, like for
Yeah.
so long in so many different aspects. And for some, geothermal means literally drilling a hole into some hot rock and magically generating electricity, which sounds cool. But there's a lot that happens between drilling a hole into hot rock um, before we can charge up our Teslas using geothermal energy. Can you give us the 101, like how that works for the listeners that like just kind of like there's a lot of abstract here. How do you get electricity from drilling hot rock?
Yeah. So let me just take a step back and comment on what you're saying there a little bit. So worldwide, there are roughly 16 gigawatts of geothermal electricity being produced. And I'm I want to say that is about 0.1% of the worldwide electricity that is produced. So it's a very, very small portion. But when you look at the potential, meaning the heat that is inside of the earth, there the potential is in the tens of thousands of gigawatts. I forget the exact number, but it is sufficient amount of energy to supply the whole world with everything they could ever need if there was just a way to actually pull out that heat and use it in a
Hmm.
productive way. And that's
Wow.
what you're getting to with this question of how do you actually go from heat beneath our feet into electrons on the grid? So first you have to find it. That's kind of my specialty, is that resource characterization. for anybody who is for anybody. Hey, sorry, hold on.
Yeah, no worries. No, this is okay.
Sorry, I'm recording a podcast. It's a video one, so so I um could you? Is that okay? My office is my office is in the kitchen, so
That's awesome. No, that's
usually
good.
I usually record my podcasts in the closet because
Nice.
it's
No,
quiet. I
Joe,
think you told me to do that actually. I
I
think
may
you were the
have.
one who led me to the closet. Yeah.
Well, now you've upgraded to the kitchen space. I like
Yes.
that.
Yeah, absolutely. It just looks better with the video and all that.
Yeah,
But
dude, no worries.
yeah, so going back to that. So going from the heat beneath our feet to green electrons on the grid, first stage is exploration. That's kind of my specialty, that resource characterization. It looks very similar to oil and gas exploration, except that you are looking for a thermal resource.
Right.
So instead of oil and gas, you're looking for heat. And then you're also looking for water to move that heat. So it's basically you're looking for a hot aquifer. And then there's a little bit of nuance on where you are, how are you going to produce it? Are you looking for faults to naturally have that flow, or are you going to create those faults through hydraulic stimulation? So once you find the heat, you find the resource, then you drill your wells, figure out how to produce that heat. In that scenario, you can either flow water, flow in that water. That water is the medium to extract the heat, bring it up to the surface. That can happen either naturally through faults, or you can create that fracture network through that hydraulic stimulation.
Okay.
That would be, excuse me, that would be just directly producing that heat out. Now there's a future technology called closed loop geothermal systems. That is where you drill one big long well, and that well, you're just flowing a fluid through that well, and that fluid interacting with the rock right next to it is extracting that heat out. Now,
Okay.
this is called a closed loop system because the well itself is only intersecting the rock right there with the well. You're not actually exchanging fluids with the rock. You're
Gotcha.
just kind of pulling heat off. Think of the well as almost a radiator. It's like one little tube, and it's sucking heat off of the rocks.
Okay.
And that is an idea where maybe you can't have hydraulic stimulation, or there's not going to be enough fluids to pull that heat out. You're just going to have that well, and now it can extract all the heat for you, and you don't have to worry about the amount of water or what you're doing with that water.
Fascinating. Okay.
And so once you pull that heat to the surface, now this part's a little bit easier. You're essentially taking that heat, spinning a turbine with that heat, and that spinning turbine puts electrons on the grid.
Perfect. That makes sense. And I mean, again, like, so if you're interested on how that works, Google it. For the listeners out there, how a turbine generates electricity is that's fairly easy to understand conceptually. But for the purpose of the question, it's the heat is essentially turning a turbine, which then generates electricity. Which again, going back to your point of just how much potential there is, I guess that's one of the questions I always have is how come this hasn't taken off? Because the science has been there forever and the understanding of how much is there. I would imagine a lot of it's due to the economics, but aside from that, like, where do you see, or how come you've seen this have such a slow adoption?
Yeah, the economics are one piece of it. I think one of the reasons that it is so expensive is because exploration is expensive, and because you don't actually generate any revenue until you're putting electrons on the grid.
Sure.
So if you've got with exploration, it ultimately, if you have too many dry holes, you're going to have a failed project, even if you know where that resource is generally. because traditional geothermal, which is kind of mostly what we have today on the grid, you were looking for faults that had very high flow rates. These are flow rates of anywhere from 25,000 to 50,000 barrels of water per day. That's kind of like a regular profitable geothermal well.
Hmm.
And if you didn't hit that, there wasn't really anything you could do. It was either you've got a well that's going to work, or you don't have a well, and maybe you can turn it into an injection well.
Hmm.
And all of this was upfront cost. You were never generating profits until you actually build your power plant and sell electricity. So I think there's this very high risk that has ultimately always kept investors at bay. People haven't been as excited about it,
Yeah.
and that has kept growth slow. And then that exploration component, we're still trying to work on new technologies to discover what's called hidden geothermal systems, basically anything that doesn't have signs at the surface. So the majority of oil and gas prospects, they don't have signs at the surface. So taking some of those technologies and those ideas, trying to transfer those over now is kind of where we're at with building exploration tools and exploration technologies that will help us make that exploration, I guess, increase the confidence and make it more successful.
Interesting. And that was what I was going to ask, is kind of where we're at now in the life cycle, if you will, which it sounds like, again, I know a gentleman over at Ormet Technologies, who, who's very, I mean, again, he's been in the space for a long time, but some of the stuff that he's talked about, and I had him on, oil and gas on shore a while back. I tried to get him on, but he's just so busy, but, I had to connect you to him here at some point. But, again, it's, so based on what you're saying, I mean, because for a lot of time it was the sort of like, I guess, the outsider perspective of geothermals. It only works in certain parts of the world because there's only certain parts where there's shallow rock that generates that much heat and all the rest of it. But what you're saying is, with through advanced technologies, essentially, because as you go deeper, regardless of where you're at in the world, it gets hotter. Some gradients have a higher degree of getting hotter sooner than others, but like, do you see geothermal, cost aside, being applicable almost anywhere?
Yes. Yeah. So we're currently getting those better exploration techniques to find it cheaper. And then that second part of what happens if there isn't the flow rate you need? What happens if you can't find a higher gradient area? Well, now we're getting those technologies through oil and gas technology transfer to be able to drill deeper, faster. Being able to drill deeper and faster makes those wells less expensive. So that helps us. And
Yeah.
then also, if you don't have that naturally occurring fault to get those 25 to 50,000 barrels of water a day, now we can start stimulating those in certain areas and essentially being able to create the reservoir we need to get those higher flow rates. So
Gotcha.
it's through that technology transfer that we're going from kind of being focused on actively tectonic areas, meaning the ring of fire, to what hopefully in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll see every major sedimentary basin having its own geothermal plant. That's what I would like to see. Gulf Coast has several projects that are that have been discussed. I think there's a maybe a few leases right now that are geothermal leases in the Gulf Coast,
Wow.
and I hope that before the end of 2023 there will be a geothermal well in Texas, a
Nice.
newly drilled geothermal well in Texas. That's my
Is
hope.
is there anyone that of that you can disclose that is working on this, or any company that's working on this for
I
for
think
Texas?
the yeah the projects that I've seen and heard about, you pointed out Sage Geosystems earlier. They've made some public announcements on projects that they have. There's another company that I know is Criterion Energy Partners. They made an announcement on a lease that they've got.
Cool.
Um, there was a Texas lands lease sale in October or maybe December of last year,
Hmm.
sometime kind of Q4 timeframe, and they
Gotcha.
did have geothermal blocks in there.
Huh.
I I don't recall how that went, but I think you're getting and seeing this momentum, and it feels like every week I see another startup that's either Houston based or Austin based that is a geothermal startup
No
looking to
kidding.
make geothermal kind of more pervasive.
Wow. That's and yeah, I mean, I really hope it does take off because, well, A, for the potential, but B, even just from a jobs perspective, I think, it would create just a ton of opportunity for folks to enter the space to really make a difference. Because a lot of and again, a lot of the subsurface work is similar to oil and gas, to where, there's a lot of folks that say within oil and gas, as our headcount continues to shrink over time, we have a tremendous amount of skill set that would apply, well for, say, something like geothermal. So from that aspect, I think it's super fascinating. You mentioned before we actually started recording, and something I want to talk about, and because this is a big topic just in general with especially, say, call it solar, but a lot of the ones that are intermittent that generate a ton of power intermittently. It's like, what do you do with the excess, right? So talking about energy storage, you mentioned Petrolern is it, sorry, Petrolern, correct?
Yep.
Yeah, Petrolern is working on some cool technology. I'd love to hear more about it.
Yeah. So thanks for teeing that up. When we
Sure.
talk about energy in general, one of the biggest things right now is the solar and the wind and their intermittent nature. And we recently finished a project for the Wyoming Energy Authority looking at their geothermal resources. It's hard to look at something like Wyoming and not see their wind potential. And they've got some of the greatest wind resources in the US. And they but when it comes to geothermal, theirs is it is kind of on the lower temperature side. So that's an area where we were just thinking, well, you've got this great resource, and it's very similar to kind of central Texas, where we've got this great wind resource, but you don't have the geothermal energy to act as that base load, kind of the way natural gas right now is the backup to wind and solar. So we were, and this is it's not our original idea, but we're trying to find a way to make it economic, saying if we can take all of that excess energy, store it in the subsurface as thermal energy, and then produce it later as geothermal energy in essence. So creating a synthetic geothermal reservoir, how can you do that on an economic scale? And there's a lot of different components here. Basically, you're drilling wells, you're making a reservoir, you are managing that reservoir, and you are timing this with the market in order to buy power and then sell power when you need it, but also when it is most profitable.
Is that
So it's a
sorry, it reminds me, and sorry to interrupt, but it reminds me of hydro when they fill up a dam,
yep,
and then when they need it, they they release it to generate power. Is it
yep.
kind of similar-ish?
Yeah, yeah. So this is essentially doing subsurface energy storage in a
Wow.
we're doing it with thermal energy,
Yeah,
but it's very similar to pumped hydro. And
that's right.
really
Yeah.
it's essentially the same as large battery banks that are there for storage, except when we talk about subsurface thermal energy storage, we are talking about ultra long duration. For most battery banks, it is either a 4 or an 8 hour window of how long those are good for. You charge them all day and then you have 4 hours of charge at night.
Hmm.
For this, we can store seasonally. So when
Wow.
the wind is blowing in the springtime, but then it's kind of dead in the summer, we can charge all spring long. And then in the winter, when we have all of our AC kicking on, we can now discharge that thermal battery and use all of that excess energy. So this
Wow.
becomes something that isn't a 4 or 8 hour battery. We're talking about 4 days, 8 days, even we've modeled up to 1,000 hours and finding ways to make it technically work at 1,000 hours. And now what we're doing is saying, okay, we know it works, we know how to make it work. Now let's optimize it for price and try and drive that price down to something that is not only cost competitive for storage options, but also cost competitive and even beating some of the existing energy options.
Wow, man, that is crazy. I would have never thought to store energy subsurface like you're speaking of. That, I mean, again, I could see that being kind of, groundbreaking.
Yep. Yep.
If done
Or
and
not groundbreaking because we're
true.
not.
Touche. Yeah, good point, man. Yeah, I mean, wow, that is fascinating. And then once you do that, you tie in kind of like you're talking about, like smart grids and everything else. Like you get super efficient, you know how much to discharge at what time. You can predict how much, based off historical data, how much you're going to need. I mean, it's just I see the future of that being extremely fascinating, and
Yeah.
again being part of the puzzle, or part of the piece to the overall energy puzzle, and it be playing a huge part. I think is fascinating. I mean, to me, that's like we're not even in the first inning. We're probably just warming up. Like, am I right by saying that? Because this is not being done currently. Is it? It's more so just in
Correct.
theory.
Yeah. So there are at I guess there are similar conceptual ideas that are occurring not for energy production, not for electricity production, but aquifer thermal energy storage, kind of seasonal heating and cooling that is occurring.
Hmm.
And most of those projects are over in Europe. For electricity production, it's not occurring.
Okay.
So we are still kind of in that nascent stage there. And then really
Wow.
figuring out how to do this large scale economically, I think are some of those key parameters that we're still working on and figuring out. Because I think
Wow.
I mean, there's a lot of different moving parts here. We've
Hmm.
got the energy market, we've got the wind or the solar resource, then we've got everything we talk about when we talk about subsurface and energy production. So I think just to give another plug here that I think is important is that really figuring that portion out, really being able to do this at efficient, quick, um, cost effective scales, really that whole subsurface component is essentially a new green drilling boom. That
Hmm.
is having the service companies that are existing in oil and gas being able to do this at large scales, having operators being able to take over reservoir management and kind of run it at a it's almost think of it more of like a water flood or a CO2 flood as
Hmm.
opposed to just extracting from a reservoir.
Yeah.
So it becomes this new subsurface game or who out there really does know the subsurface. That's the oil and gas industry. That's where
Hmm.
the bulk of that expertise is right now.
Wow.
So getting buy-in from the oil and gas industry and seeing that natural progression from oil and gas reservoirs to hot water aquifers. Excuse me. I
Oh,
think that is going to really what opens up not only subsurface thermal energy storage, but also kind of opens up the entire geothermal market.
wow. No, it's clearly the potential, and some of the things you guys are working on are again could completely change the game, and it's exciting, right? We're in such a exciting time right now where, I mean, I don't know what sort of the appetite is for investment on this type of stuff. I would imagine there is a fair bit, uh, depending. I would imagine maybe overseas. Like, I guess where are you seeing a lot of the money come from for projects, say in geothermal? Is it a lot of it over in like Europe, or is the US starting to kind of get on board? Just maybe from
There,
the Inflation Reduction Act, perhaps, maybe, or
yeah. So the Inflation Reduction Act, I think, is really changing the the landscape. There are opportunities, and we've looked at different ways of calculating based on the incentives and the carbon credits and all the different ways. And even thinking about, okay, what if we're developing a project purely for hydrogen production? Where does that come in?
mm,
Because the hydrogen production credits are huge. So there's a lot of different ways to do that math, but I think that the IRA is helping bring investment into the US. We've seen a lot of interest from foreign entities because of that.
gotcha.
But stay and there's a lot of investment kind of on a weekly basis. I see information coming out on new projects or new RFPs in different areas. I'll give a quick plug here for another newsletter that would be interesting for anybody interested in geothermal. It's called Think Geoenergy. That's
Okay,
one that they compile all of the different news articles for geothermal and send out every Tuesday morning.
awesome.
But two major interesting players that have entered geothermal kind of in a in a public way, in a very interesting way, is Chevron.
Okay,
Chevron has started a joint venture with a company called Baseload Capital. Baseload Capital is a Swedish company, but they have an arm here in the U.S. And then Chesapeake has made investments in geothermal as well. They've had a
interesting.
few different announcements. One, well, I think just to make sure I don't say anything wrong, I'll just leave it at that. I've
Yeah,
seen Chesapeake has made these different investments. That's pretty interesting as well.
Aubrey would be so proud. I just know it. That's cool. I had no idea Chesapeake was even involved with that kind of stuff, but it's cool because you are starting to see sort of US uh based like traditional oil and gas companies work into being more energy focused. By that I mean all forms, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's conversations being had, and then some of the majors, most of it was all about carbon capture, CC, CCUS, and sort of focus more on that side of energy transition, where the Europeans were a lot more focused on alternative energy and renewable energy. But now you're starting to see kind of a sort of a good mix come into play, and how that plays out for earnings, is a whole another topic for another day. But ultimately, you're starting to see a lot more companies, bolt on different verticals within their organizations or different business units that do focus on, the very things we're talking about. The last thing I was wanting to ask you about, which again I think is awesome. I'm huge on content and branding and educating through platforms, is your Thermal Thursdays. It's you definitely don't paint a broad brush over topics. Like, you get pretty nitty gritty with it, for the amount of characters that LinkedIn allows you to use. But I'm curious, man, like what's your intent behind that? And I mean, because while you play in that sandbox, so I would imagine it's not difficult to come up with topics weekly, but it takes time, and to make sure that you're putting out quality information for those to learn from. Why do you do it, and what's sort of the benefit that you're seeing for putting out that type of content?
Yeah. So originally I started because I think kind of what we were talking about earlier. I felt like there was a period where geothermal it wasn't the hot topic that it is today. And I was that kid pouting in the corner with my arms crossed saying, why isn't anybody looking at this energy? Why
Yeah,
aren't people giving me a job to go do this? So I think and finally that frustration built into me wanting to like say something and do something. And
awesome.
I think that's kind of where Thermal Thursdays came from. And also a lot of the things that I've talked about on there are just kind of these fundamental principles behind thermodynamics that say what you're talking about there isn't like you're missing a lot of things because you're just worried about this part of it, but you don't even think about the thermal ramifications of what you're doing. So I think it all started from that of almost like that was my revolt against people not thinking about this in a scientific way. And
Uh,
so it was like it was a way to educate people but also help me feel better because I was like, hey guys, is what needs to be said. I don't care if anybody reads it.
yeah,
I need to say this to let off some steam.
good for
And
you.
yeah, and I surprisingly people, so now it's like, okay, what is something I'm doing right now that is interesting, that I'm thinking about, that I think others could get value from?
Yep.
And I so it's you're right, coming up with topics isn't, it's kind of like whatever I'm thinking of at the time. And and I guess I'm having fun doing it. I'm getting that interaction, which is really interesting to see what others think of it and where it goes.
Yeah.
As far as what that end game is, that I don't really know. I think it I'm enjoying sharing knowledge and helping people understand a little bit more, and hopefully one day I'll be able to sit down and say, okay, what is my plan? Because that's something you point out and you're very good at with your content, is saying there's a method to this. There is a reason I'm doing it, and this is where I'm going to start. This is where I want to end, and these are the posts that are going to get me there.
Mm,
Right now, my thermal Thursdays are just kind of. I just want everybody to, like, when they walk outside and feel the sun, like I want them to first think about the thermal energy that they
yeah.
are actively absorbing from that.
I love it. Yeah.
Or when they feel the wind, they actively think of, oh, that is because there are pressure differences associated with the amount of heat or amount of sun that is hitting over there on those rooftops, being
Yeah.
absorbed by that asphalt, that is forcing the wind to start convecting. Like
Wow.
those are the things I want people to just kind of start thinking about and appreciating. That's
Wow.
my only thought right now.
But
Hopefully
you
it
know, it's
turns into something else.
and you know what? I think a lot of people do start creating content for, without necessarily an end game. Which is totally fine, right? If as long as, and this is what I tell people all the time, as long as the intent is selfless and it's to create value for people, like you said, it's not like I want people to know that how smart I am. It's like I want people to at least learn something to where then they can go outside and appreciate something that they may have not appreciated. And to me, that's good enough, right? It doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily, you don't have to necessarily have this grandmaster plan to start converting and then all of a sudden generate, a bunch of sales from it where you're going to start selling courses on geothermal. It's like, I mean, that's cool too, right? It's like kind of the old jab, 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 right hook. You give, 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 and then all of a sudden you have a course and you're like, hey, I wrote this ebook. If you could buy it for $1, that'd mean the world to me. Most people would be like, well, you've provided me with so much value. I'll give you my dollar because Joe, you've earned it. You know what I mean? But if
Yep.
not, that's cool too. It's like whatever. But I love people who put in the work and effort to educate and create content around information that is critical for people to at least know about. And the cool thing about the internet is on there forever. And you may look back and be like, I can't believe what I was thinking. But it's kind of it's the journey, right? Like there's things
Yep.
that I've posted years ago. I'm like, man, like I posted last year talking about within 5 years, every company's going to have an NFT strategy. I'm probably going to look back and be like, I can't believe I thought that. But at the time I did, I really did. So
Yeah.
it's but either way, man, I can appreciate it. As someone, in energy, I think education is something that we've had a tough time doing, but now a lot of people are doing, putting in similar type effort to educate for the sole purpose of just again allowing people who don't necessarily get to sit in the same social circles as folks like yourself that are in the weeds get exposure to things that are digestible and really that help make them ultimately make better decisions about what they do around whether it be energy or what they consume or whatever the case is. But no, I commend you for that. Joe, this has been a fantastic conversation. uh, there's always one question I like to close out with, a little more on the personal side. But what's something about yourself that not many people know about? I mean, I would imagine you're a pretty open guy, but is there anything that kind of like any unique hobbies or anything you do that people that may be able to identify you with, and they might reach out on LinkedIn and be like, I didn't realize you liked underwater basket weaving too, Joe.
Yeah. I think one thing that I, as far as LinkedIn and as far as kind of outside of my personal interactions and circles, I am a huge Survivor fan. I know that's
Oh,
like that's not super personal and awkward, but
no, no, it's cool.
I've applied for Survivor like 3 or 4 times,
No
and
way.
and
What?
I keep trying to apply. They still don't choose me. I think it's
What?
I think it's one of those things that if I'm not talking to somebody I already know,
Okay.
it my conversation just seems kind of weird and kind of just like deadpan awkward. And it's not until people know me that they start seeing like my sense of humor is like drier than chalk.
Okay.
And
That's cool
at
too.
least that's my delivery. It is so dry that people don't know if I'm like being serious and I like hate them and I'm being very condescending, or if I'm just
Right.
like being funny somehow, trying to be.
That that's good.
But
That's good.
yeah, so like I'm a huge Survivor fan,
Okay.
and with that and like survival, homesteading, self-sufficiency, like all that are things that are part of me that I don't necessarily always talk about,
Sure.
but I
So
love
where does that
Survivor.
so okay, so I mean again, I think it's super cool. I think all of us have some something in our DNA that I mean at the end of the day, we at back in however many thousands of years you want to go, we all were meant to survive, and as
Yeah.
humans we've become so accustomed to this modern day of living, but at the end of the day we do have some innate nature to learn or to know how to survive depending on our environment. But like for you growing up, did you grow up in like the woods, or did you see something on TV that just like captivated you, or like where does that come from, right? Like that's what I'm asking.
Yeah, I don't really know. So I did grow up kind of rural Illinois. So not I drove about 5 miles through cornfields to get to high school.
Okay.
And and then there were woods, river nearby. But as far as like where that comes from, I don't know. I just think it in some ways it's this it is a now I'm blanking on the word, but in some ways I have this can't think of the word, but
No worries.
self-reliance and almost a conceitedness or like arrogance, like, oh, I can do it myself, which
Yes.
I mean
Okay.
that there's that like bravado that I've got that is not it's not a necessarily a good thing, but it at least gives me a strong enough head that usually I can break through any wall with it.
Yeah. No,
But
that's and again, not everything needs a perfect answer, right? And it's
yeah,
I think, kind of going to your point of saying, I can do it on my own. It's I mean, ultimately you're someone that probably is up for a challenge, but it's like to prove to yourself, like I could literally do anything, and as long as I have me and myself, like I can survive. I think is kind of cool, right? And I was gonna say if you don't make it on Survivor, there's another show you could try is Naked and Afraid. Now I don't know if you're up for that one, but if I see you on Naked and Afraid, Joe, I'm gonna be super pumped because I'll be like, he made it. Not necessarily a Survivor, but he made it. Uh,
well,
have you have
I
you
will not
seen
go
Naked
on
and
naked and afraid. No, I'm not interested in that. But
Okay.
it
But no, survive. That's cool,
yeah,
man. I think it's great. If anyone out there's listening and they're Survivor fans, I mean, there you go. There's your warm introduction. You can headline your email or your LinkedIn message to say, I love Survivor too. Let's talk geothermal and maybe go
yeah,
survive somewhere in the mountains of southeastern Tibet. I have no idea.
yeah.
But Joe, this has been an absolute pleasure, man. I really enjoyed the conversation. appreciate all the work that you're doing ultimately to provide energy to the world. And it takes all of us, right? And so you don't have to necessarily spell it out, Joe, but what are some good resources that you have, or what's the best way for people to reach out to get to know you or your company?
Yeah, so you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. It's just Joe Batir. You can find our company, Petrolern. It's spelled Petro and then Lern. That's it, petrolern.com. We do
Yeah,
actually have training courses. So if you do want to learn more information, we do training courses, but we also focus on subsurface consulting and technology development. If you want more generalized geothermal information, I would point you to thinkgeoenergy.com.
perfect.
And I think, yeah, feel free to ask
Awesome.
me any questions and go to those people.
Perfect. And go check out OGGN's. It's the Energy Transition Podcast. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, Energy Transition Solutions podcast. Thank you for giving that call out.
Hell
So
yeah.
yeah, I talk about kind of all things energy, really focused on that energy transition. How do we get to net zero? How do we decarbonize?
Excellent.
And just we talk all sorts of things. Eventually, Justin, I'm gonna have you on. So once we
Perfect.
can get
I'm
that
all of
scheduled.
Yeah, I'm all about it. I don't know how much I can talk about energy transition, but I can sure as hell talk about branding and drilling holes in the ground for oil and gas. So you let me know.
Yep,
All right,
sounds
everyone.
good.
Perfect. Joe, thanks again, buddy. I'm wishing you the most amazing year. 2023 is going to be the best year ever. And for all the listeners out there, please subscribe, leave a review, all that fun stuff. I don't have to repeat it over and over again. You know what to do. And always remember that everyone deserves access to energy, and we is greater than me. Thanks, everybody.